Good morning from Cookeville, Tennessee, and from Boston, Massachusetts. My name is Andrew William Smith, also known as Teacher on the Radio, instructor by weekday, DJ by Saturday at Tennessee Tech in Cookeville, Tennessee. We put out a radio show called Teacher on the Radio since 2007. We're into our 18th year now on Saturday mornings at 9 a.m. on WTTU 88.5 FM. And we also do live streams and podcasts. And I am so honored today to have a guest poet, and also a guest curator of the playlist for the Saturday show before her visit to Tennessee Tech. Welcome, Amy.
Hi, nice to be with you today, Andrew.
Amy is a faculty member at Boston College who recently went there from West Virginia and spent a big part of her career in West Virginia. And we're going to talk a little bit about being a woman of color and living in Appalachia today, but we're also going to talk about poetry and maybe even a little bit about some of the songs that she chose for today's playlist and her career as a teacher and as a poet. So Amy, welcome to Teacher on the Radio. We're so glad to have you.
Thanks so much.
So why don't we start and hear a poem from your brand new collection. There's a brand new collection just out in 2024 called Makeshift Altar. And I imagine that will form a lot of the reading that we get to hear on Tuesday, October 29th in Bell Auditorium, room 282. It's free. It's at 6 p.m. and it's open to the public. So you all come on, and we're going to hear now a poem from my guest, Amy Alvarez.
So, Andrew, you requested this poem from me, which is really nice of you. It's called Morgantown, West Virginia. And this was about my time living in Morgantown, just kind of thinking about all of the things that are possible, wonderful, problematic in West Virginia. Morgantown. The list of Wi-Fi networks in our neighborhood runs from FPAD to Xfinity. Across the street, a chained dog won't stop barking. It's cold, he whimpers like a child. Maybe it's the train's whistle that upsets him. We're far from needing the warning in this bed, smelling of fabric softener, the soft pepper of cats. Trains carry the coal that brings back the money that state politicians use to gussy up the now-flooded golf course they frequent, hire some university professor with dusty books she can't part with. Little is spent on miners' black lung, on their shattered children, tracks on their arms forming maps of constellations they'd like to become someday.
This is Teacher on the Radio, and we're making a live stream this morning to be a part of our radio broadcast at the end of the month on October the 26th, 2024. My guest today is Amy Alvarez, and I want to ask you a little bit about your poetic origin story. How did you find yourself? When did the word poet become a part of your personal identity? How did you come to literature and writing? Was it through reading? Was it through pop culture? Was it through life experiences? Just tell us a little bit about yourself too, a little bit about your biography that brought you to being a touring and an invited guest speaker and keynote on my campus.
Sure. Yeah. So I was an avid reader. I was an early reader. I was really fortunate in that way. My mom was really encouraging about having me read. She was not a reader, so she kind of was pushing me to become the reader in the family. So I remember just having a lot of books around at a really young age, kind of just that early period of learning how to read. And I was really taken, I think about 6 or 7. There was this book, it was a children's book of verse, and it was just this kind of large illustrated book of poetry. And I became so obsessed with this one particular book. And I didn't understand what it was that kind of kept me reading the same things over and over again. Because, children's books, you kind of read it from the beginning to end and you're finished. But I was like, why do I want to reread this poem? What is compelling about this? The Highwaymen was really one of the poems that got me. It's such a brutal poem. A woman shoots herself to save her lover. I mean, you're 7 and you're just kind of like, what does this mean? And what is this about? And it's a ballad, and you're looking at repetition and rhyme and just thinking about like how complex it is. I don't know why they had that poem in this book of children's poetry, but it was so compelling to me. And I feel like that's kind of what started my my love for poetry. I also grew up in New York City, kind of in the golden age of hip hop in the 90s. And so I remember growing up with a lot of hip hop around me and kind of recognizing some of those same patterns, right? Those kind of same metrical patterns, poetic patterns in hip hop that I was reading. Also, one of the first books of poetry beyond that kind of children's book of verse that I got when I was a child was from my aunt, who gave me a book of Nikki Giovanni's poems. And so that kind of Black Appalachian spirit, I guess, was there early too. It was been a soft Black song. And I just remember being so taken again by her language, by her words, by the kind of hidden simplicity of what she does. I guess hidden depth within the simplicity of what she does on the page. So I think that around 15 was the point when I was like, maybe this is something I could do. Is this a thing that people still do? I was in a high school classroom and we were doing a unit on poetry. And I remember going home to my mother and saying, I think I want to be a poet. I think that's a thing that I want to do. And of course, my mother said something along the lines of like, you will be poor and you will starve to death and I will not feed you. So best of luck. But she was still supportive and encouraging, I guess, when I became an English major. She was just glad that I was the first in my family to go to college. So I think they were just glad I was doing anything. I was a history and English double major. And I remember at about 19 sitting in my advisor's office. And my philosophy professor came into my English professor's office and they were talking about I think it was maybe German. It was a translation of poetry. And there were two adults talking about poetry in a way that was meaningful and about language in this way that I didn't hear people talk about language in my everyday life. And it was really beautiful and exciting. I remember looking at my professors and saying, I want this when I'm grown up, something along those lines, probably something more complex than that. But I just said, do you think I could ever become a professor? Is this something that the two of you think I could do? They both said, of course you can. It was the first time anyone ever said that to me. And I remember that was the moment when I was like, okay, this is the path. I ended up becoming a New York City public school teacher. I taught high school in the Bronx for a few years. I taught high school in inner city Boston for a few years. I earned my MFA while I was teaching full time. I was a New York City teaching fellow and got a master's in education. So I had this kind of interesting trajectory into higher ed and kind of launched myself, I guess, propelled myself into it. But yeah, I had a position as a lecturer at West Virginia University that kind of turned into a position as a teaching assistant professor and an associate. So I was just really glad to kind of be on that path. I was of course writing the entire time, kind of through all of that. From 15 onward, I had a little notebook that I was keeping and really trying to write constantly. And I think all of that work and then workshopping, I worked at Gotham Writers Workshop for a while just so I could get like free courses in New York. So I really just tried to do everything I could to kind of find my way in to writing. And then, yeah, over time, I guess I kind of got to a point where I felt like the manuscript was good enough, because after the MFA, I was like, nothing's good enough. No one will ever publish anything. You take a couple of years and you're kind of just going back through it and it's really frustrating. But eventually I got to a place where I felt the book was ready. And now that I've done it once, I'm already working on book number 2. So it's kind of an interesting path that once you get started, you kind of can't stop. But it's been a journey.
This is Teacher on the Radio, and we're making a pre-recorded interview for a future radio broadcast, but we're also going to put this out there on the interwebs on YouTube and Facebook for anyone who would want to. I'm Andrew Smith, also a poet who lives in the South, and my guest is Amy Alvarez, and her journey was from New York to West Virginia and then up to Boston. But I loved what you said about sort of seeing poets and professors doing poetry and professorly things, talking about ideas and language in ways that are passionate and that matters and that cares, and noticing just I guess the ambiance and the aura of that as a young person, saying, I want that life. Because I remember I was trained as a journalist a little bit in high school and college. And I remember the time that I decided to be an English major instead of a journalism major was around wanting to be around those poetry teachers that I had and wanting what they had. I didn't see the journalism majors going to bars and coffee houses and having this kind of literary experience in an inner city like Detroit. Teacher on the Radio here. My guest is Amy Alvarez. Amy Alvarez is going to be generous enough to come to Cookeville and share her words with us. I did appreciate you mentioning your early influences like Nikki Giovanni and this this cultural series that you're coming as a guest of is a fund dedicated for events like this. And Nikki Giovanni is one of your predecessors in this reading series many decades ago, as Maya Angelou, Anne Lamott, Margaret Atwood. So you're going to be walking in those in those worn paths of literary experience on a college campus. So I think for me, so I'll be more ready to tell my students and to tell whoever's listening to the interview. Walk us through this idea of Appalachian poetry and the idea of the Appalachian identity, and especially a little bit also, so maybe a little bit about what that is for the newcomer, but also a little bit about your journey from New York to West Virginia and what that was like for you to make that transition and to really embrace it. Because like you, I came from the Midwest to the South, and I mean, I'm not kidding. This is something I said coming from Detroit to Cookeville. I'd never seen so many white people in my whole life. So just tell us a little bit about that journey for you, Amy.
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in New York City, as I said before, but I ended up falling in love with an Appalachian, and that's kind of part of how the journey started. So I married someone who's from the Blue Ridge Mountains out in Stanton, Virginia, and who went to West Virginia University as an undergrad musician. And so, yeah, I kind of fell in love with an Appalachian. I guess I fell in love with Appalachia since that's the place that he's from. And so I kind of started to understand that place through his perspective and meeting his friends and kind of learning about that region of the country. I remember when I met one of his best friends from college, I couldn't understand what he was saying. It's the first time I'd met someone who was from deep in West Virginia, and it took me a minute to kind of catch the accent, which now, of course, it feels like home. But it was a really interesting kind of moment there. But yeah, so I grew up in New York City. I ended up coming to Boston for a bit, and I taught high school here because that's where my now husband was living. So I moved up here to be with him. And then actually the way that we ended up in West Virginia was that he finished grad school and was applying for positions, and his alma mater hired him, which was really exciting. And I was just like, wow, okay. And then they hired me, which was really exciting. And we ended up on this journey together going to West Virginia. I'd never actually been to West Virginia before. I'd spent a lot of time in Western Virginia. So I knew a little bit about Appalachia through that. But it was really my first time going, but we were kind of exploring, like, where are we going to live? What will this look like? And yes, it was one of those experiences. I was like, no, there's a lot of white people here. But I remember this kind of moment, especially in Morgantown. I was like, there are far more people of color here than I expected. A lot of things were different than what I expected. We ended up living in a neighborhood where, I mean, the house that we ended up living in there was a sign next door. I was kind of like, it was an election year when we moved, and there was a Bernie sign next door to us, and there were Black Lives Matter signs, like, throughout the community. It was much different than what I expected. And the people who lived in our community were great. A lot of them were connected to the university, of course, students, graduate students, faculty members, people who worked in facilities and who were staff there. So it was a beautiful community that was really kind of interconnected. And I really enjoyed my time there. And as part of living in Appalachia, I started reaching out to the Appalachian poets. I'd started reading Frank X. Walker years and years before. I'd actually been teaching the Appalachian poets in Boston, like not really thinking about but the voices of Appalachia, I guess, have always been resonant with me. Like I said, all the way back to reading Nikki Giovanni as a child. So I was teaching Kelly Norman Ellis. I was teaching Frank X. Walker. I was having these conversations with students, and they were really responding to the work, in part because I think that there's something deep and resonant about Appalachia. It's a place where people who are Black have literally been excluded linguistically. The definition of an Appalachian is a white person, a poor white person living in the mountains of Appalachia. So there's already a problematic definition that we begin with. And then I think from that kind of legacy and that point, of course, you have folks like Ed Cabell and William Turner kind of trying to turn that around in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. But I think that Frank X. Walker's moment of kind of creating this word Appalachia in the early 90s was part of how do we actually linguistically try to push this idea that we are here. that we exist here, that and I think that through that, like, we exist here, and that kind of insistence on, as he says, rendering the invisible visible, right? How do we make the invisible visible, is a really kind of key component, I think, of that. So I started to connect with other folks. I started to connect with folks in West Virginia, and then kind of more broadly at conferences and various things that were happening in the region. And over time, as my work kind of began to expand, I kind of became more on the radar of other folks in the Appalachian world. And I was invited to become an Appalachian poet. There's an induction ceremony in 2022. They do it every like 5 years or so. They'll kind of add maybe a handful, I think in this case, 5 new poets to become Appalachian poets. So I was really honored to be among them. It was a tremendous, tremendous honor. We were all in Lexington, Kentucky, and it was really amazing. Yeah.
I'm Teacher on the Radio. My guest is Amy Alvarez. Amy Alvarez is a lifelong poet who has lived in New York, Morgantown, West Virginia, and now is coming to us from Boston, Massachusetts. She'll be at Tennessee Tech University as part of the Center Stage series, speaking to us on Tuesday, October the 29th, which is actually 2 weeks from today. So we have 2 weeks to get all of our friends to come out. It's going to be free. It's in Bell Hall 282, and it will be at 6 p.m. Amy, what would you say is the thing about you? I loved you telling about living in the college neighborhood and how pleasantly surprised you were with how much you lived in Morgantown. What is that you now bring with you living in a very different community in Boston? Boston has a very particular style and identity culturally, and I think you couldn't, even though geographically you're not that far, I don't think you could be more on the different poles of what people say America is today from the kind of stereotypes that we have about Appalachia. And now that you have lived there, how does that inform your work as a teacher and a poet living in the more upper Northeast?
Yeah. I felt like it was interesting being in Appalachia. I felt like it was a lot more like New York than like New England. There's something, it's very an odd thing to say, but I always kind of think of it as people are a little colder and more distant in New England. In New York, we're not exactly warm. It's not exactly what New Yorkers are known for. But there is a sense of inherent kindness. We will help you carry your stroller down the subway stairs. Like, we will help you get directions. Like, we're impatient, but we're kind. And I felt like in Appalachia, there was that same sense of, I think, being in the mountains and this kind of like working classness, I guess, that kind of infiltrates New York City, at least the New York City that I grew up in Appalachia, this kind of working class identity where you may be rough around the edges, but inherently and deeply kind, thoughtful, culturally connected. And that's kind of what I saw and what I kind of take with me. In New England, it's very different. One thing that I've been thinking a lot, though, about is landscape. I live at the top of a hill. I live at Fairmount Hill. And I feel like just being in a hilly area, I live close to the Blue Hills here. And so hiking, kind of being outside, sort of helps to reconnect me a little bit with Appalachia. I spent a lot of time outside and really understanding landscape, thinking about the idea of nativity, like in terms of what's native plants. So that's something that I've really been giving a lot of thought to here as I think about my garden for the spring. What's native? What's been here? How can I kind of reconnect with the origins of this place? Understand the history of Native peoples here. I think all of that is really important to me and something that I take with me from Appalachia.
Well, it's been absolutely wonderful to have this beautiful conversation with you this morning. My guest is Amy Alvarez. I'm Andrew Smith, also known on Saturday mornings as Teacher on the Radio. We're so excited about your visit to Cookeville and hope you have a safe and uneventful trip and don't have to cancel too many classes to be here. We are going to be embedding on Saturday, preceding your reading, a wonderful playlist you've helped me your curate, and maybe just a little bit about your musical appreciation. You mentioned that your spouse was professionally a scholar of music, and so how does kind of music help you through the day or inform your work, both as a teacher and as a poet? And maybe anything you want to, any shout outs you want to give to, we can't go through the whole thing, but if you want to give me any particular shout outs for our listeners of people that we really need to check out. I know I'm familiar with some of what you've given me, but not everything. So we're all learning this together on Teacher on the Radio this week. I'm a student this week of you. You're my guest teacher on the radio, so to speak. So maybe just a little bit about your how you nowadays a lot of authors, they make playlists to go with the book. So this is a very common thing these days. But maybe just a little bit about your appreciation and your aesthetic that's informed the songs we're going to be hearing when I take this interview and place it inside a radio show.
Sure. So I guess as I kind of think about that, I actually was a musician for a while. I was a saxophonist, amateur, but I played a lot of gigs and kind of did my thing. So I think that there was an early period when I was kind of in basements of weird clubs in New York City, reading poems and playing saxophone in a really kind of strange avant-garde way. Joy Harjo, of course, has been doing that for years, but I didn't know about that then. So it was really kind of delightful to kind of see that and start like recognizing that she was doing that work as well. I may want to add to my playlist a little bit and kind of get some of that sort of vibe in there. But yeah, that was something that kind of appealed to me. I ended up marrying another saxophonist, a very professional saxophonist and jazz saxophonist. And we've just kind of discovered a lot of music together. Of course, he's introduced me to things. I've introduced him to things. But yeah, it's been a really interesting kind of, I guess, musical journey. Some of what's on that playlist is connected to my ancestry. My mother was born in Jamaica. My father was born in Puerto Rico. And so a lot of that music is what I grew up with. So you'll kind of hear some of that filtering in. Some of the music is more kind of jazz focused, which is what I listened to in my teens because I was a saxophone player. So there's some Alice Coltrane and there's more contemporary, like Micaiah McCraven, who's a great composer and jazz drummer. And then there's a lot of kind of electric stuff that I really liked and a lot of hip hop that I listened to growing up and kind of more recently. So I guess it's a little eclectic. So maybe a little random, but I feel like it does, I guess, filter through my own lived experience. And some of it does, I think, connect to the book. And some of it's just kind of my own kind of oddity, I guess, coming through. There's one poem, one song, it's based on Gwendolyn Brooks' We Real Cool. So it's a hip hop song called Gwendolyn's Apprehension by the artist Mick Jenkins. And I think that that's kind of a unique piece. I've taught it before to my college students, and they've really loved that interconnection of seeing what can happen when someone kind of plays with a pre-existing piece.
Well, I'm so excited to be unpacking this with you and with my audience, and I'm so excited. I'm going to tell all my students to attend your reading. I'm going to tell all my colleagues to tell all their students to attend your reading. I hope we'll get a decent turnout. So looking forward to meeting you in person. Great to meet you online. Great to have this back and forth. Your book is incredible. The book is called Makeshift Altar. It's out this year. I'm sure University Bookstore will be present with copies for you to sign for us. Thank you for joining us on Teacher on the Radio. I was so moved and almost heartbroken by the honesty and also the structure of the poem. Is it The Other Mothers from your collection? Why don't we close out this morning conversation with a poem from Makeshift Altars? This is Teacher on the Radio, and my guest today is Amy Alvarez, reading from her new collection.
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. So this poem is titled The Other Mothers. It is written after Angela McDonnell, kind of an homage, but very much about my mother, who she was and is. The Other Mothers. The other mothers were dignified, proper, stockings without patched runs, crisp suits. My mother was a little late. Fuchsia sweatpants, my forgotten lunch, band uniform, essay in hand. The other mothers were stay at home, never learned to drive, brought covered dishes to the potlucks. My mother was revved engine and bumbaclat after being cut off. She was 12-hour hospital shifts, scalded pot, rock-hard falafel, Chinese food, cold pizza. The other mothers could crochet and knit, iron the sheets, hummed as they vacuumed. My mother held nails in her mouth, smelled of varnish. She hissed at the piles of laundry, said that she worked like a goddamn dog. Her work song, smack of hamper top, stomp of stair, whir of washer. The other mothers rushed their children to the ER after a fall, turned their plump faces away from the bleeding. My mother was the savior of trapped baby squirrels. Hacker of lizard tails, splint maker, better by tomorrow soother. She sucked her teeth at foolishness, looked at everyone and saw a story.
Well, I've spent my morning in the best way possible talking poetry with another poet. I'm Andrew Smith, teacher on the radio. My guest today has been Amy Alvarez. Her brand new book is called Makeshift Altar. She's going to be visiting Cookeville and Tennessee Tech on Tuesday, October 29th. The big public reading and talk is going to be at 6 p.m. in Bell Hall, room 282. Amy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.